This video will be about E. Cummings and, in part, about Edna St. Vincent Millay. Millay, one of the, I think, best American poets of the 20th century, not up there with Frost and Eliot, but certainly a very interesting one who wrote several very memorable poems, is given more space than anyone else in this unit, and so I'm going to spend 1.5 videos on her. The poem that, very much like Bryant's Thanatopsis, I think the similarities are interesting. An odd title in another language, a poem having to do with death, a very long poem about spiritual ideas, written early on in the writer's career. Millay was only a college student when she wrote this remarkable poem, even more remarkable for someone that age. And then in both cases, the poet going on a long time after writing that one very famous poem. Having a good career, Millay won the Pulitzer Prize, the highest literary prize in America, several times, I think, but never quite, again, reaching the public success and the notice that either Bryant got with Thanatopsis or that Millay got with Renaissance. But to finish on Millay, if you look at the bottom of 469, she has a few things in common with E. Cummings, the other poet we'll look at now. They were both from New England, her from Maine, him from Massachusetts, but it doesn't have any particular impact on their writing. They were not evoking the atmosphere of New England like Freeman or Jewett did. Cummings, probably more famous, not necessarily because of any greater depth in his poetry than Millay had in hers. He's just famous for one thing, which has nothing to do with how good a lot of his poems are. He didn't use capital letters very much. In fact, and I'm glad our book didn't do it because I personally find it really annoying. You may find this if you search E. Cummings and look at any of his poetry that's available. In fact, it's very common for the name E. Cummings to be all in small letters because he has so many capitals missing. Well, if you look at Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town, you see some capitals in the titles, and you even see a couple of capitals in Anyone. So it's not that he never did it, but he selectively missed out capitals a lot. He used punctuation in an unusual way. And these poems are very normal looking by Cummings standards. Some of his poems, like one I read in school, In Just jump around the page and the lines are put in very odd places. And sometimes I think it's for meaningful effect. Sometimes I think Cummings was just saying, hey, look what I did. It's different. Cummings is a good poet, but I think it's unfortunate that he's known mainly for these experiments with the way poems looked. You do have to be deciphered a little bit, like a code almost. If you read Anyone through once without looking at it closely, and hopefully you did more than that, it seems like some sort of childish nursery rhyme that's been kind of mixed up. To me, it almost seems like someone's taken the lines and phrases from a Mother Goose and cut up the papers and put them back together another way. But if you look at it more, it's really a very deep poem, and it really does have a lot to say. And that's the best thing about Cummings. When his poems that seem kind of childish and simple on the surface are shown to have a real meaning underneath. Let's look at page 473 and just those first lines of Cummings' poem. Anyone lived in a pretty how town with up so floating many bells down. I remember when I read that in school and just thinking, what is this? And you probably did also. In the next line, spring, summer, autumn, winter. Well, at least we can follow that. And Cummings was an accomplished poet, even if it looks like he's just playing around on the surface. One of the things he does, which I've talked about before, is a refrain. He also will not put the refrain in exactly the same part of each stanza, so he shows some creativity in the form of the poem. It is in the fourth line, not the third, of the second stanza that Cummings writes, sun, moon, stars, rain. And in this next one, it's in the third line again, but he's moved the seasons around a little compared to the first stanza. It's clear by now what's going on, because he refers to children, and he says, up they grew in that same stanza. This is time passing. This is the story of a person's life, and our book mentions it, and perhaps you could have picked it up anyway. Anyone means he could have been anyone. This is a man like all of us. He makes it a little trickier and kind of a joke when he says no one. No one is every woman, his wife. And the joke is in line 12, no one loved him. He was not loved. Well, that's actually her name. And 25 and 26, he died, and no one stooped to kiss his face. Not that he was not loved after his death. No, again, that was his wife. And then in the next line, busy folk buried them side by side. We see in the very next line, his wife has died now too. But there's a sense that there's not just an end in this death. I think of Hamlet saying, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. They dream their sleep in the next to last stanza when they're both dead. So there's something happening. It's not just an eternal sleep. The time passes in almost all of the stanzas. At the end, very effectively, he uses both the seasons passing and the kinds of weather and the sun and the moon. They follow each other day by day, night by night, of course. Anyone and no one are gone, but the world goes on. They go on in some way. And it's a lovely ending. There's this sense that all of the sweep and mystery of life is being described there. There are several other excellent lines I'd like to briefly point out. 14, she laughed his joy, she cried his grief. That really describes love. She shared all his feelings. Line 21, and only the snow can begin to explain. How can we understand any of it? What's the purpose, the meaning of all of this? He seems to be asking. And he's saying that somewhere in nature, in God, whom Cummings did believe in, and so you really have to read it closely to pick it up. Renaissance has a much more ordinary form than any of Cummings' poems. You can see the rhyming couplets all the way through. All of the lines have four stresses. It's an easy poem to follow. And when we look at the beginning, it's just describing a landscape around the speaker, and we don't think we're in for anything strange. But although Renaissance has a story that can be more or less followed, it also becomes a little difficult to pick all the meaning out of. I believe that it's really about the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that Jesus Christ experienced. It's about picking up all of man's suffering and being crushed down into death by the experience of that suffering and that sin, and then being in the grave and then coming out of it at the end. How does this happen? It starts with a very interesting image, which perhaps Millay was just looking up at the sky one day, thought it seemed so large, and yet perhaps it was, I imagine, a strong, deep blue, almost like you could reach out and touch it. And the strange part of the poem begins, after all this description, in right around line 25, when she reaches up to the sky and actually can feel it. What's going on after this very strange image? Imagine that you put your hand up there and it knocked against something as if the sky wasn't infinite. I think it has to do with the narrator's feeling that she can do what God does. I know some popular movie called Bruce Almighty, which I haven't seen, There's something about a man being given God's powers and I suppose can't handle it. But the real terrifying power that we absolutely could not handle as finite human beings is made much more meaningful and described more strongly in this poem. Infinity came down and settled over me. It's frightening in the poem, around line 30, forced back my scream into my chest. Because what else would happen if we couldn't handle infinity? How can we handle what Jesus handled? How can we take all of the world's sins upon ourselves and all the world's suffering? And that's exactly what's going on in the 3 or 4 little sections after that. All sin was of my sinning, all atoning mine. Millay makes it visual and specific by putting a starving man sinking ships into it. Again, it's terrifying. All the screams of suffering humanity, line 76, every scream tore through my throat. What could she do but die? And so in the middle part, it says her tortured soul burst forth. She was then in the earth, and there's some interesting descriptions of what it would be like to be buried in the ground, know that it's raining above. Even Tom Waits used Millay's line in one of his songs, 113 and 114. The rain has such a lovely sound to those who are 6 feet underground, is how he adapted that. Rain, of course, is a bringer of life. So now we are in Jesus' Saturday, the day in the grave, and it's the water of life, very familiar phrase from the Bible, that brings the narrator back. The last part of Renaissance, the resurrection part, of course, as we would expect, begins with the narrator coming back to life. Not exactly like Jesus with the angel rolling away the stone, because as I've said already, this is not Jesus himself and not somebody who can handle all the sin and suffering that Jesus could take upon himself. But kind of dramatic, God sends down this huge rainstorm, and on line 155 and 156, the rain in one black wave fell from the sky and struck my grave, and he can feel the rain, and it brings him back to life. I picture him almost like washed out of the grave, like I imagine seeing the coffin shooting up out of the ground on this flood that was caused by the big rainstorm, although Millay does not actually use such an image. It is here that Millay states, as it were, the moral of the poem. The narrator now understands our connection with God and God's real role. She has the narrator saying, God, I can push the grass apart and lay my finger on thy heart. Everything in the world, the grass, my own speaking, the cool eve of every day, line 200, shows us God. No longer does the narrator think the sky is small, God is small, but understands the difference between a soul which is connected to God, which is, as it were, three-dimensional. I'll say later why I said that. That if we are close to God and seek Him and love Him, we will be able to see Him, but those whose souls are flat, and all the meaning of that word flat is very clear in what the narrator suffered when she misunderstood God's role. The sky that she was able to touch before, is going to punish him and show him what God's weight really is.